When I was 14, I was nominated by my school teachers to take part in a student conference on globalization and its effects. And it was supposed to be kind of a big deal with a big presentation at the end at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. So, in doing research for the conference, I learned for the first time about concepts like the widening income gap or the loss of cultures and the impact of globalization on the environment. But eventually, I dropped out of this project for many different reasons, but one of which was that I thought it was quite strange to be talking about inequality at the Ritz-Carlton. But more than that, it was just ignorance. At age 14, I thought this very abstract discussion on globalization was just irrelevant to my life, which was concerned with friends and shopping and getting good grades. So, I really had no idea that globalization, inequality, the impact on culture and the environment would define and still define the world that I live in. And I was looking back on this period of youthful ignorance because these days I feel like I'm in the opposite situation where every time I look in the news, especially in this time of COVID, it seems to be just screaming at me, globalization and inequality. And maybe it's just the nature of news on the internet, right? Where last year we might have seen a picture of all these people in a giant pool party in Wuhan, now ready to celebrate, how the city has moved on from COVID and everyone's fine now. And then you scroll down and then you see pictures of mass graves in Brazil. And just a couple of days ago, I read that, there was a big music concert in New Zealand, huge numbers of people at a big football game in Australia. There are cities trying to set up travel bubbles. The EU wants to accept vaccinated American tourists. And then on the same page, you see people hooked up to oxygen tanks on the streets in India. People in the Philippines getting treated for COVID in plastic chairs because the hospitals are just out of beds. So I personally find this contrast difficult to witness and to reconcile in my heart. It almost feels like we are celebrating heedlessly when people on this planet are still suffering very deeply from this pandemic. And I remember too, when I started to have some kind of more political awakening at college, I found this kind of contrast almost depressing. Where in class we might learn about genocide or the horrors of colonialism, and then you step out of class and everyone wants to talk about what party are you going to this weekend? What are we serving for cocktails on Thursday night? Which just made no sense. And I would say a big reason why I came to monastic life was because of this deep wish to find some integrity between how I live my daily life and what I'm concerned about in the world. And so as I wonder, what might a global recovery from COVID look like? I was thinking back on what Venerable Jigme said some days ago about how there is no historical precedent for racial equity in America. And likewise, there is no historical precedent for global health equity in the history of this planet. And I started to wonder too, is it going to unfold like how things went with AIDS? Where basically things return to normal sooner for people and communities who have access to antiretroviral drugs. And for those who don't, then too bad. We look very briefly at the history of AIDS. In the 1980s, AIDS was first detected in the US. And by 1987, the first antiretroviral drug was approved for use in the US. But 2 decades later, in 2002, AIDS continued to be the leading cause of death in sub-Saharan Africa. And I read that in 2017, for the first time ever, more than half of the global population living with HIV are receiving antiretroviral treatment, a record of 19.5 million people. So that's how long it's taken for HIV treatment to become widespread. 4 decades. So even as we see pockets of recovery in some cities, we are far from seeing a global recovery from COVID. And I wonder, what is it that these doctors, nurses, and essential workers have struggled so hard and fallen sick and lost their lives for? Is it for our right to go out and watch football and party? We have to ask ourselves, how will we who are so fortunate to be alive, how are we going to go forward with our lives in a meaningful way, in memory of the sacrifices that so many people have made? So I, of course, don't have clear answers to these questions. And in closing, I'd just like to share a poem that I've read many times during this pandemic. At the start, it was because it resonated for me very much with the situation of being in lockdown. And maybe now it's a bit of a prayer, really, that I wish that, before we rush out into bars and pubs, a friend just texted us to say that, oh, in Hong Kong, now the bars and pubs are reopening this week, yeah, back to business. Before we rush out to celebrate and maybe drown our sorrows, I think it's really important to pause and take stock of what we have learned about life on Earth in the past year and more. So this poem is called Keeping Quiet by Pablo Neruda, and you can look for the original in Spanish if you know how to read Spanish. Now we will count to 12, and we will all keep still. For once on the face of the earth, let's not speak in any language. Let's stop for 1 second and not move our arms so much. It would be an exotic moment, without rush, without engines. We would all be together in a sudden strangeness. Fishermen in the cold sea would not harm whales, and the man gathering salt would look at his hurt hands. Those who prepare green wars, wars with gas, wars with fire, victories with no survivors, would put on clean clothes and walk about with their brothers in the shade, doing nothing. What I want should not be confused with total inactivity. Life is what it is about. I want no truck with death. If we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving, and for once could do nothing, perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves and of threatening ourselves with death. Perhaps the earth can teach us as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. Now I'll count up to 12, and you keep quiet, and I will go.